What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the Australian black thrash metal icons, Destroyer 666. Full disclosure here, I am a total Destroyer 666 fanboy. Since first discovering the band around 2008, I've consistently loved the band's combination of black metal, thrash metal, and often other styles as well that are delivered in a way that's very catchy, very triumphant, and usually has some of the best songwriting in extreme metal. Destroyer 666 started way back in 1994 when vocalist, guitarist, and founding member KK Warslut left his prior band Bestial Warlust. After recording a demo and the band's debut EP, Violence is the Prince of This World, KK would recruit other members from the Australian metal underground and release the band's debut album, 1997's Unchain the Wolves. It's really interesting to look at the lineup of Unchain the Wolves today because this album is almost like one of those movies where it featured a bunch of actors and actresses before they became famous. Here, the lineup is pretty much a who's who of the Australian black thrash metal underground. In addition to KK, you have Ian Gray, aka Shrapnel, on guitars. He would later be the lead guitarist of the band Nocturnal Graves. You also have Mark Howitzer on drums, who's probably most famous today for being the bassist and vocalist of the sadly defunct Australian black thrash metal band Gospel of the Horns. And then finally, you have an individual named Bullet Eater on bass who had played alongside KK in Bestial Warlust and also played in the underground Australian thrash metal band Hobbs Angel of Death. I think together this group of individuals really crafted some excellent stuff here, but the really defining trait about this album to me is how much it sounds like a reaction to Bestial Warlust. And by that I mean it sounds like KK was intentionally trying to craft something that was different than Bestial Warlust was. Whereas that band was more of a war metal band akin to what you'd hear on a Revenge or Black Witchery album, Unchain the Wolves is much slower and has more of an influence from not only thrash metal, but also early black metal like Celtic Frost and Bathory, along with even some of the darker moments from 80s heavy metal, especially Merciful Fate. The album is set up so you have these sprawling epics, these shorter and catchier songs, and then these more atmospheric songs, but all combined in a way that's really cohesive. And what's also interesting is that a lot of these songs have hooks, even when you wouldn't necessarily expect them to. I think the 10-minute opening track, Genesis to Genocide, is a good example of that. I love the part in the verses of this song, for example, where KK goes, "You know that I was in fucking chains, chains." And then when he says chains, the drum beat hits right along with it. The title track is pretty much infamous for its chants of "Unchain the Wolves, Unchain the Wolves, Unchain the Wolves." And then, of course, the shorter cuts like Australian and Antichrist and Satan's Hammer are pretty much live staples for the band today, with fist-raising lyrics and really simple but punchy riffs that are pretty addictive. In terms of the more atmospheric cuts, you have songs like Tyranny, which cruises along with some acoustic guitar and still manages to work in some catchy ideas, like that lyric, "Then came the flames." Just the way it's enunciated just makes for a really cool hook. There's also just some really great riffs on this album. I like the main riff of Genesis to Genocide, which just sounds like an army is bearing down on you. The lead work also in this song and the title track is just fantastic. It's very epic, very evocative, very cool. I think this album also showcases KK's vocal prowess. He's got a really vicious snarl, and I love his lyrics about wolves, women, and war, which would really be the title of one of the EPs, but I think is a good summary of what the band's lyrical content is usually about, especially on these earlier albums. I do have a couple quibbles with Unchain the Wolves. Some of the guitar parts are a little simple to the point where it almost affects my enjoyment because the ideas or the progressions are just so simplistic. I also think the band's later material would be a little catchier, a little more tightly written, and just stand out a little more overall. That being said, I think Unchain the Wolves is a really fantastic album. It's a very ambitious album, and it sounds different than not only Bestial Warlust, but just everything else out there, really. I can't think of another album that sounds quite like this one. It's very atmospheric, and it feels like there's a lot to unpack here. And yeah, while it's not my favorite in their catalog, I think they would do better stuff. It's a standout album in my book, and definitely one of the better albums in the black thrash genre. All right, so following Unchained the Wolves, Destroyer 666 would return in the year 2000 with the album Phoenix Rising. A little bit of a lineup shift with this one. Mark Howitzer would leave the band, leaving Jaro Raphael to take over on drums. Jaro is probably best known for being the bassist, vocalist, and guitarist of Nocturnal Graves. In terms of talking about Phoenix Rising, I'm not even sure where to start. I already thought Unchained the Wolves was a great album, but Phoenix Rising is not only better, but significantly better. And I say that as someone who thinks Unchained the Wolves is an extremely good album. But Phoenix Rising is not only one of my favorite black thrash albums, I would say it is probably one of my favorite albums of all time in any genre, if not my favorite. I think there's a couple really simple reasons for that. One, it has a lot of really fantastic songs, but even beyond that, I think the way the album is arranged helps the songs complement each other, such that the album is really more than the sum of its parts. For example, the opening track, Rise of the Predator, is just an amazing and anthemic song with these pummeling blast beats, really aggressive thrash riffs, and then a chorus where you have this simple, repeated melody, all the while the band just chants, Predator! Predator! It's an awesome opening track, and then it's immediately followed by the song The Last Revelation, which is a slower and more atmospheric song with some evocative bass guitar. Listening to The Last Revelation on its own, I probably wouldn't think it's that phenomenal of a song, but I think coming after Rise of the Predator, it provides a nice little breather that sets things up well for the rest of the album. In general, I'd say the songwriting has improved on Phoenix Rising, whereas Unchained the Wolves was 50 minutes. Phoenix Rising is a 40-minute album with the same number of songs, and because of that, the songs just feel punchier and tighter and very concise, but with a lot of ideas neatly put together within each one. I think you especially hear that on the title track, which is actually a re-recording of a song from KK's former band Corpse Molestation. The song has some really churning mid-paced black metal riffs, and then culminates in a really climactic melodic riff, and then a recitation of a few lines of poetry, which are apparently from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. It's pretty much impossible to talk about this album as well without mentioning the song I Am the War God, which is probably the band's most famous song, and for good reason. It's got these really epic, streaming war banner riffs, and then a rapidly picked melody in the chorus, all the while KK just shouts, I am the War God! And I also love the vocal patterns in the verse of this song too, very cool. Lone Wolf Winter is another excellent song, and probably my favorite Destroyer 666 song overall. It's got a really super catchy but simple melodic riff kind of holding things together as it maneuvers through different movements that remain consistently engaging. And then the song closes out with these clean vocals, which just come almost out of nowhere. And the clean vocals just repeat this kind of melodic line, all the while KK snarls over it and along with it, but allows the clean vocals to breathe at times. It's such an amazing ending. The Birth of Tragedy is another amazing song and probably the band's best closing track. That riff that comes up in the last 90 seconds and closes the album out is one of the most epic and triumphant riffs I have ever heard in my life. It is just phenomenal. Yeah, front to back, I consider Phoenix Rising just a masterpiece of heavy metal songwriting. This is my favorite Destroyer 666 album, and pretty much my favorite album of all time. I'd have a tough time thinking of any album that would top this. This goes right to the top of the ranking. Alright, so following Phoenix Rising, Destroyer 666 would return in 2002 with the album Cold Steel for an Iron Age. Another lineup shift with this one, Bullet Eater would leave the band, leaving Simon Berserker to take his place on bass. Simon would later form the Australian black thrash band Assaulter, which is another excellent band that I would recommend viewers check out. Additionally, Jaro Raphael would leave on drums, and that position would get taken over by Chris Menning, aka Mercis, who's done some excellent work with the German black metal bands Homicide and Zarathustra, which I would also recommend checking out because they are very good. Yeah, in terms of this album, it's really an interesting one. It came out only 2 years after Phoenix Rising, but yet it feels completely different stylistically. And yet despite that huge stylistic shift, quality-wise, it's almost just as good as Phoenix Rising is. Whereas Phoenix Rising kind of sat in the niche of being epic and melodic black metal, Cold Steel very much feels like a pure black thrash album. Compared to Phoenix Rising, this is more aggressive and more in your face. Whereas the last album felt very ethereal and philosophical at times, this one just punches you in the throat and gives you direct riffs, direct songs, very direct lyrics, and shows absolutely no mercy. The opening track, Black City, Black Fire, is a good example of that, with its propulsive riff, its anthemic chorus, and then this cool kind of waltzing break that comes up about a minute and a half into the song. The title track is another phenomenal song, starting off with clean picking before launching into verses that are punctuated by shouts of "Burn! Burn! Burn!" Yeah, it's fucking great. Sons of Perdition and Savage Pitch are both excellent songs, kind of mixing a little bit of melody into the black-thrash formula. Savage Pitch, in particular, has one of the best melodic riffs ever as its verse riff. I fucking love this song, and it is another one of my favorite Destroyer 666 tracks. Meanwhile, The Calling slows things down a bit and kind of serves as the album's swaggering and anthemic call to arms. I love the shouts of "Gather round, you fire starters!" Yeah, these guys really know how to write hooks, and I think this song definitely shows it. I do have a couple quibbles with this album. The song Raped is a very heavy and extreme song, which I think works well here, but the lyrics are a little cringe, and even KK has acknowledged that himself in the liner notes for the vinyl reissue of Cold Steel. Shadow is the closing track, and it's a pretty cool song. I like the main riff, but that main riff is pretty repetitive, and it doesn't feel like it has the power that a closing track should have to me. Every time I listen to Cold Steel, I love one song after another, but then when the closing track hits, it just always feels like a little bit of a letdown. And I think because of that, I always prefer Phoenix Rising a little more, because Phoenix Rising, I think, just provides a better full album experience than Cold Steel does. Even if Cold Steel, I think, has some phenomenal songs, and probably more songs that I'd pull out for a playlist than any other Destroyer 666 album. My criticisms of this album are really minor quibbles. If Phoenix Rising is one of my favorite albums of all time, this is easily a contender for the top 5 and certainly in the top 10. Alright, so following Cold Steel, Destroyer 666 would release a EP in 2003 named Terror Abraxas. While I don't include EPs on my ranking list, I did want to mention this because it is amazing and definitely worth checking out if anyone is exploring their discography. 2 of the tracks in particular are pretty much live staples for the band. Those being A Breed Apart, which kind of combines the thrashier feel of Cold Steel with the more epic feel of Phoenix Rising. Then you also have the track Trial by Fire, which I would say of the band's more epic songs is probably the best one. But following Terror Abraxas, the members would move to different countries, leading to a 6-year recording gap between Terror Abraxas and the following album. It does kind of make sense because this was in the mid-2000s when it was a little harder to collaborate over the internet. But the band would eventually overcome that and release their 4th full-length album in 2009, Defiance. Defiance is an interesting album. Destroyer 666 had a lot of hype in the underground in the mid and late 2000s, so I think there was a lot of anticipation for Defiance, but the reception upon its release seemed pretty mixed. And I think a big reason for that was the production. Defiance definitely feels like a little bit of a victim of the loudness war. The sound here is very compressed, the guitars are pretty mushy, and that saps a little bit of the power, and in addition to that, the production's also pretty polished, leading to a pretty modern-sounding album that was quite different, I would say, than the more old-school feel of their prior albums. While I'm definitely not the hugest fan of the production, though, I don't think it ruins the album, and I think some people might not be giving the album a fair shake because of the production, because like Destroyer 666's first 3 albums, I think Defiance is another amazing album. Stylistically, this album feels very melodic, very modern, and yet it retains the aggression and the epic feel of their prior albums, while still delivering fantastic songs and delivering fantastic variety, which is something the band have always done really well. The opening track, Weapons of Conquest, has always been a favorite of mine. I love the way it swirls together those black and thrash riffs in just a relentless onslaught, with guitar solos just crammed in everywhere. Blood for Blood is an interesting song. It opens up with a slow melodic riff that kind of sounds like something from Bolt Thrower's The Fourth Crusade, and then it has some really catchy twirling melodies that come in later in the song. A Stand Defiant is also pretty different. It has some unique, winding and intricate riffs, but then culminates in some catchier moments, and then even features some gang shouts in the outro, which make it feel more direct. Human All Too Human is, in my opinion, one of the band's most underrated songs. This, to me, feels like the forgotten cousin of Lone Wolf Winter, and in terms of the band's bigger and more epic songs, this, to me, is one of the best. Defiance also features one of Destroyer 666's biggest curveballs, and that's the closing track, A Sermon to the Dead. This is one of the strangest and most underrated songs in their catalog. It's built on this hypnotizing and repetitive melody, and on top of that, you have these traditional, soaring choral vocals. along with KK's snarling rasps, and then a lot of like echoing lead work. It kind of sounds like it would be a mess, but everything just clicks perfectly. It's one of those songs where everything just falls in place and it just works. The song is just very haunting and grand, very almost dreamy, and I think that's helped by the lyrics, which are inspired by the philosopher Carl Jung. Yeah, honestly, I think A Sermon to the Dead is probably the best closer other than The Birth of Tragedy from Phoenix Rising. Really phenomenal and really underrated song. Not all of the songs here are amazing. There's no real weak spots on this album. I think it's consistently good, but I Am Not Deceived is probably one of my least favorite songs here. It kind of just feels like a B-side from Cold Steel. The Barricades Are Breaking is another song that is not my favorite here. Kind of just feels like a straightforward black metal song without too much interesting going on. I would say, generally speaking, too, the quality of the songs on this album is a little bit lower than the two prior albums. But those albums were near perfect, so that's not a huge criticism of Defiance, because I still think the songs here are really good. I should also mention I kind of have a little bit of a personal bias towards this album. This was the first new Destroyer 666 album that came out after I got into the band, so I've always had a bit of a soft spot for it. It is tough to feel that way, though, because even the band don't seem to like this album that much. They don't play anything from it live anymore, and KK didn't write any of the music on this album, although he did write the lyrics. So I've gotten the impression from interviews with him that he's maybe not the biggest fan of this album either. That said, I think this album is generally pretty underrated. With a few better songs and maybe a better production, this could have been better than Unchain the Wolves in my book. Still a phenomenal album, and I'd probably rank this in my top 50 favorite albums of all time, but not quite on the level of their first three. Alright, so Destroyer 666 would return in 2016 with their fifth album, Wildfire. Obviously another big recording gap here with that 7-year gap between this album and Defiance, and the band seems like almost fell apart during that time. The only member returning from Defiance for this album was KK. He has an entirely new lineup behind him. Most notably, Felipe Plaza, who plays bass guitar on this album and is currently one of the guitarists for Niflheim. Stylistically, Wildfire is kind of a black thrash metal album, but infused with definitely a lot of old school heavy metal riffs and spirits, which is, I think, a cool progression for the band. There's a lot of gang shouts on this album. The title track has some big Motorhead vibes, which is pretty cool. And the opening song, Traitor, even opens with kind of this air siren scream that you'd hear on like an early Slayer or maybe even a Judas Priest album. Again, I like that progression for the band, and this album did seem to get pretty positive reception on its release, but I definitely don't agree that it's a better album than Defiance. And to me, the biggest problem is that this feels like the first Destroyer 666 album that really has filler on it. The instrumental track Artiglio del Diavolo, for example, is a song I'm a little mixed about. I think it was a really good idea making an instrumental track the third track on the album. It certainly worked for Iron Maiden's Power Slave album, and I think it does provide a nice little break after the first two songs. But in terms of the content of this song, I just don't think it has any really interesting melodies or interesting riffs, and it kind of just feels like a bit of a breather before the song Hounds at Your Back comes in. In terms of other kind of filler, the song Die You Fucking Pig is probably the worst song here, and also probably my least favorite Destroyer 666 song overall. It doesn't really do anything wrong, but the riffs are just really painfully generic and pretty forgettable. Even some of the better songs I have issues with, the song Hymn to Dionysus, for example, is a neat track. It kind of feels like a callback to the melodic black metal of Phoenix Rising, but the ideas just aren't as engaging, and something about the performances on this song just makes it feel lacking in conviction. Live and Burn is a pretty cool song. It's got some really lively riffs and some echoing gang shouts in the chorus, but man, this song is really repetitive. To me, this is a 4.5-minute song that easily could have been cut down to 3 minutes. Aside from that, though, Wildfire has a lot of variety, and it's really well constructed. I love the opening track, Traitor, for example. That's just a straight black thrash fist raiser, and it's got a really cool Asphyx style like break in it where you just have this huge marching war riff that just works really well. Hounds at Your Back is also probably one of the band's best songs overall. That main melodic riff is terrific. I also love the way they build tension during the verses of this song, and then you kind of have this shouted chorus with the winding guitar chords in between, and a little bit of implied melody from the vocals even, which is pretty cool. Tamam Shud is a cool way to close the album with some Hammerheart era Bathory vibes. Yeah, overall, Wildfire definitely has a lot of high points. It's just an inconsistent album, and I think that's the biggest issue for me. It's still a great album, and I considered it one of my favorite albums of 2016, but I think Defiance just was a little bit more consistent, even if it had some issues with production. Yeah, still a great album, just not quite as good as their other stuff. All right, so that brings us to 2022 with Destroyer 666's newest album, Never Surrender. There were again more lineup changes with this album, with only KK and Felipe returning from the previous album. And going into Never Surrender, I was a little skeptical, mainly because of the first single, Guillotine, which was a well written, kind of heavy metal, speed metal style song, but with a chorus that had lyrics that I couldn't really make up my mind whether were cringe or whether kind of were. Honestly, hearing that song in the context of the album didn't really help either. The punky shouted chorus, lyrics aside, just didn't really work in the context of the album, in my opinion. It kind of just stuck out with like a sore thumb. I do think some aspects of the song were a good representation of the album as a whole, though. Never Surrender definitely continues with that classic heavy metal influence that really started to appear on Wildfire, and I would say becomes even more pronounced here. On Never Surrender, you have a lot of melodic and catchy heavy metal and thrash metal style riffs, a lot of blistering guitar solos, and a lot of gang shouted choruses. In fact, I don't think there's a song here that doesn't have gang shouts in it somewhere. There's definitely times when that formula works. The opening title track, for example, is terrific. I love these really energetic melodic riffs that appear during it. The call and response chorus is really catchy and really cool. It all just makes for a really cool and energetic opening song. Sadly, though, I do have to say there is one pretty big problem with Never Surrender that never really arose on a prior Destroyer 666 album, and that's you have a sequence of songs here in the middle of the album that kind of run together for me. And the reason why is that they all kind of have a pretty similar tempo and a pretty similar feeling. They follow a very similar formula. Basically, a lot of the songs in the middle start off with kind of a catchy 80s style thrash or heavy metal riff, all of which sound pretty similar to each other. Then you escalate into usually pretty basic and usually fairly repetitive chorus with lots of gang shouts, and then an instrumental foray worked somewhere in there to prevent it from feeling like a cut and paste song. That formula isn't bad, but when you have just a sequence of songs that all feel very similar and all follow that same formula, it makes the album feel predictable. And I also don't feel like these songs necessarily execute that formula particularly well. I've already mentioned how the riffs can kind of sound similar to each other, but with the song Mirror's Edge, the opening riff is actually identical to the verse riff from the previous song, Pitch Black Night. I also don't find the hooks on some of these songs to be as great either. I really like the melodic black metal riffing that you hear on Pitch Black Night. It kind of reminds me of something you'd hear on a Dissection album. But when the chorus comes around, I just find it really basic and really repetitive, and it just really fails to engage me. Even the song Grave Raiders, which it seems like a lot of people have enjoyed quite a bit, is not really something that engages me or hooks me in. In terms of other complaints about this album, KK's vocal delivery here is a bit more of a gruffer shout, which is definitely more in line with what he's done on later albums, particularly Wildfire. But I have to say, I do kind of miss his snarling vocals, and even when they appear, the context in which they appear isn't always the most interesting. For example, the song Rather Death, which features probably the most snarling vocals of the album, just isn't a song that I find particularly interesting, and I think it's easily outclassed by the vast majority of Destroyer 666's other songs in their catalog. One other thing that kind of bothers me about this album is that it borrows some ideas a bit from prior albums. One of the riffs in the song Guillotine, for example, sounds really similar to a riff from Hounds at You Back from the previous album. Then the song Savage Rights uses a riff that I'm almost positive is just the slightest variation of a riff from the Cold Steel for an Iron Age album. I'm also not the hugest fan of the closing track, Batavia's Graveyard. It's kind of got a slow swagger to it and feels like an old sea shanty, which isn't a bad approach, but I think it's just not really my thing. It doesn't really do much for me, and I pretty much find every prior closing song that Destroyer 666 has done to be better. There definitely is some good stuff here, however. I like the song Andraste, which kind of harkens back to the melodic black metal of Phoenix Rising, and doesn't feature that same formulaic structure. In fact, it doesn't really have a chorus at all, but it does escalate with some really cool ideas, and it makes for a really climatic second half that I think is really neat. I'll also say, compared to Wildfire, Never Surrender is definitely more consistent. There's nothing here as generic or forgettable as like Die You Fucking Pig from Wildfire. But I think Wildfire did have higher highs to it, and I think it was sequenced in such a way that it made for an overall enjoyable all-around album. And that's not something I can really say about Never Surrender, because I think particularly that sequence of tracks in the middle that all feel really similar to each other really just drags down my interest. And I just don't think there's a strong enough song here to make up for it. Even my two favorite songs here, that being the title track and Andraste, still aren't phenomenal Destroyer 666 songs. I mean, they're good, but they maybe break my top 20 if I was ranking all the band's songs. So yeah, it definitely pains me to say this, but I have to say Never Surrender is definitely my least favorite Destroyer 666 album. Still a good album overall. I still think it's a pretty notable release from this year. Not sure if it'll make my year endless or not, but I have to say it is a little bit of a disappointment being such a big Destroyer 666 fan and having to rank their newest album at the bottom of their discography. But as with any band, we'll always have the prior albums, and I'd recommend listening to those. But that'll do it for this video, guys. If you like this video, please subscribe. Please drop me a like. Let me know in the comments, as always, what you think of Destroyer 666 and how you would rank their albums. And if you want to see me talk about more Australian metal, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of the band Denouncement Pyre. But that's all for now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay heavy.